Hi again. In this lecture, I'm going to be discussing how to structure your essay using claims that relate to your thesis statement, as well as how to interpret your claims and pursue implications. First of all, though, before I begin the PowerPoint for this lecture, I want to discuss the relationships between your thesis statement and claims. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, your thesis statement is the overarching claim about your text or texts that helps your reader to make sense of your analysis and understand its importance. In other words, your thesis statement serves as the guiding idea that offers a unique perspective on the text you are analyzing, enabling your reader to see something that they may not have otherwise seen. However, in order to support your thesis statement, you're going to need a series of smaller claims. The body of your essay, which is the paragraphs between your introduction and your conclusion, needs to be structured through a series of claims that both support your larger thesis statement and build off one another in some kind of logical way. Another way to think about claims is that they serve in some ways to capture your step-by-step thinking process that ultimately led you to arrive at your thesis statement. Ideally, they capture your train of thought and help you lead your reader to certain considerations or even conclusions. But in order to determine what your main claims will be, you're going to need to have a thesis statement first. Once you have your thesis statement, you're going to want to do a bit of writing to determine which claims you can explore in your essay that will help support this thesis statement. Since there are, in essence, an infinite number of claims you could make about any given text, you're going to want to make sure that you include as much information in your claims as is necessary for your readers to be able to follow your argument. This is especially important for this assignment because you have certain length restrictions. The challenge then is to practice articulating claims that are comprehensive yet also concise. For example, and this is an overly simple example, just so you all can understand what I mean. If your thesis statement was arguing that Harry Potter defines the notion of belonging using a framework of heterosexuality, your main claims might center on different kinds of heterosexual relationships in the series and the ways in which they define or take a position on what it means to belong. Or you might look at different kinds of belonging offered by the series and discuss how heterosexuality uniquely structures each of these kinds of belonging. All of these examples, though, would serve a different purpose that helps add further nuance to your original thesis statement. In other words, each example should offer a claim about heterosexuality and belonging that both supports the thesis and allows it to evolve. Once you have a general sense about your main claims, you're ready to begin outlining and envisioning the structure of your essay. What I've included in this slide is just one possible way that you might go about outlining your essay. You don't have to structure your essay exactly like this, but I still want to give you all the option to use this framework if you are struggling with organizing your thoughts. As you might imagine, you should begin your essay with an introduction. Essentially, what an introduction does is precisely that. It introduces your reader to your topic and your main argument about your topic. In other words, your thesis statement. However, there are ways of organizing your introduction that are more intuitive than others. One of these ways is to begin your introduction by broadly introducing your topic and gradually moving into the specific, which is your thesis statement. You might think of this structure as a kind of upside-down triangle that culminates finally in your thesis statement on the bottom. However, when I suggest that you might start with a broad discussion of your topic, it is important that you're not too broad. Just like we discussed in the previous lecture about thesis statements, you don't want to give your reader the impression that your essay is going to somehow address and solve time-old questions and issues. You want to make sure that even as you're starting broad, you're still beginning in a way that is grounded in the text you are discussing and analyzing in your essay. This doesn't mean, however, that you can't relate your analysis to real-life contexts or issues. Just note, though, that when you do make these connections, they should be plausible and easy to follow for readers, especially since this is only the introduction and your readers have not read your essay. After your introduction that culminates in your thesis statement, you will have the body paragraphs of your essay, each of which should have its own clear and concise claim. Of course, there are cases in which, for the sake of clarity, you're going to need to write more than one paragraph demonstrating evidence that supports your claim. In that case, you might have a series of subclaims that support one larger claim. For the most part, however, you should try to organize your paragraphs around the claims that you've already determined that support your thesis statement. These claims should have a kind of logic and should not be in a random order. So, when you think about your progression of claims, be sure to consider what makes the most sense for your argument. Often, this might even be a retracing of your own thought process in arriving at the conclusion at which you've arrived. What I've included in this slide is a possible structure for your body paragraphs if this is something you struggle with. Although the order of these three elements does not have to adhere strictly to what I've written here, you want to make sure that each paragraph includes a point, illustration, and explanation. Or you might think of this as the pie format. In this case, your point is really the claim you intend to make in the paragraph or series of paragraphs depending on the claim. This should be a synthesis of what you intend to argue in the paragraph, and it should, as I've just mentioned before, relate to your thesis statement. Next, you want to illustrate your claim by including relevant evidence from your text or texts that help support the claim you're making. This might be a quote or passage in the text you're analyzing, or simply a detailed description of a particular scene, character, etc. Regardless of what you use to illustrate your claim, though, you should always make sure that your evidence clearly relates to your claim. And finally, you should include an explanation in your paragraphs of both how the evidence you've included relates to your body paragraph claim, as well as some of the broader implications of your analysis in the paragraph with relationship to your thesis statement. In other words, this portion of your paragraph should interpret the analysis you've just offered by describing why it is meaningful in the larger context of your essay and the conversation to which you are contributing. If interpretation is something you're struggling with, I've included in this next slide a few steps you might follow to help you out. First, you want to practice moving from observation to implication. In other words, if we zoom out from the texts we're analyzing, why is this analysis important? So what? What does it reveal that has enduring value beyond just our analysis of these texts? Going back to the Harry Potter example, for instance, what do we learn by considering how heterosexuality is used to construct feelings of belonging? What are some other contexts in which this occurs? Is this a pattern, a recurring theme in cultural and literary artifacts? How might our analysis of Harry Potter in this way help us understand other similar texts? One way you can explore these questions is by considering the interpretive context that governs the texts you're analyzing. For instance, you might want to take into account the style or genre of the text, as well as the social, cultural, historical, and political context to which it speaks. One of the things you might consider in the Harry Potter example, for instance, is the fact that Harry Potter is a contemporary young adult fantasy series. How does understanding that context help enrich our analysis of the text? And lastly, assess the extent to which one interpretation of the text you're analyzing explains the most. What are some other interpretations? What are the limitations of your interpretation? When you consider the limits of your own analysis, you position yourself well to start thinking about the kinds of questions that are still left to pursue. Doing this will help you move into the final phase of your essay, which is the writing of your conclusion. Writing a conclusion is probably one of the most challenging aspects of writing an essay. Contrary to popular thought, your conclusion does not serve to simply restate your thesis statement. Rather, your conclusion serves to synthesize your claims and pursue some of the larger implications of your argument. There is a clear difference here. When you restate your thesis statement, what you're doing is simply reiterating the same thought you started with. But when you synthesize your claims, you're both reminding your reader of the thought process that led them to this point and perhaps reframing your claims in a way that enables readers to take a step back and begin thinking about some of the larger implications of your argument. After you've synthesized your claims, framing them in a way that makes their relationships and progression clear, you're finally in a position to address the question of, so what? Why does your analysis matter? What does your argument reveal about the social, cultural, political, or historical context from which the literature you've discussed emerges? What kinds of commentaries, critiques, and perspectives does your argument make visible? And what kinds of questions does it raise for future exploration? Although you'll probably want to avoid literally asking questions in your conclusion, it's still important to think of your conclusion not as a neat bow that ties up your essay and presents it as one single comprehensive package, but rather as a springboard for thought. You want your reader to leave your essay with a new perspective that can be applied to analyses of other texts, a perspective that will hopefully enable your reader to learn something new about fiction and the function it has served and continues to serve in our world. Well, that concludes our lecture, not only for this week, but for the entire summer session. Thank you all so much for working hard these 6 weeks on your discussion posts and participation activities. I'm looking forward to reading your final papers.